Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Welcome back to this new term of SPREAD, Supporting Peer Respect, Education, and Discourse. We are a community of learning coming together to expand our perspectives and to stay curious about the world. We're here because we are too young to fall into rigid points of views. The more fortunate of us can better express or explore themselves and the world in their day jobs. But most of us can hardly say that our work weeks are truly exciting and expansive in scope. So, as we come out of this dark winter, let's bring some excitement and spark some more curiosity in each other's lives. Let's walk a mile in someone else's shoes and engage a world of ideas with friends. And the fact that it's from our peers makes it all the more valuable and accessible. We'll learn as a community, we'll develop as speakers and communicators, and we'll become better citizens. So we have a whole year of events getting lined up. So I look forward to seeing everybody more regularly. Today we have Boden, who is a math teacher here in San Francisco and who has received substantial training in implicit bias. As citizens in a multicultural society, um, we should, as we listen to Boden tell us about implicit bias, we should, of course, try to figure out how it applies in our lives, professionally and personally. So welcome again, everybody. And without further ado, here's Boden on implicit bias.
Yay!
Hey everyone, thanks for the introduction. For starters, I want to say thanks for good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. The first thing I actually want all of you to do is I hope that you're all computers. I actually want you to open up the Zoom chat really quick, and I want you to open up the link that's in the chat. The presentation today is going to be a little different from what you're probably used to with other spread events, but it's going to be a program that I use with my students as well. So if you can open that at another tab, I'll also be sharing my screen. Because there will be moments where I'm going to ask you to focus on the Zoom screen, and there will be some moments where I'm going to ask you to focus on your on the paired deck external tab, because there will be things I want to be able to interact with my audience with. Okay, so hopefully that you're all on there. Give me a moment. Let me see how many students are on here really quick. Okay, great. Looks like I'm going to wait until we have everybody here. It looks like we have about 16 people in here. So there should be about 14 or 15. In the case that you need to join afterwards, I can always send the link afterwards as well. But for now, I'm just going to get started. Okay. So like Stephen was saying, so my presentation is going to be on implicit bias. And I want to, before we get started, I also want to go over the agenda for today. So give me one moment. So next slide is, there we go. Oh, there's no annotations. Darn. That's okay. The first thing I want to do is an icebreaker. There's some people that we do know and some people that we don't know in this room, and I want to make sure that we sort of get an idea to get to know who's in the room and sort of what are our backgrounds in the room. Okay. After that, we're going to go over this grouping activity, and then we're going to go into sort of what is implicit bias, what is it compared to explicit bias, and then what is implicit bias in action, right? And then I'm going to go into sort of how implicit bias affects me as an educator, as well as in the education system. And then I'm going to go over some resources in the end that I've used to sort of help gauge my implicit bias. And then also at the end, we're just going to go over some questions and any discussion to have at the end of the presentation. But before we get there, before we get started with the icebreaker, I want to let you know who I am, right? So like Stephen was saying, I am a high school teacher. I teach at Washington High School. This is currently my second academic year teaching there, and I teach mathematics. This year I'm teaching algebra and algebra 2, and I really do enjoy being at Wash. A lot of us are alumni there. So yeah, as a reminder, I am an educator, so a lot of the things that I'm going to be saying is going to be through, a lot of the things that I'm saying about implicit bias will be through an educator lens. And then the second thing I want to specify is that everything that I'm talking about with implicit bias mainly comes from the knowledge that I've gained about implicit bias as in undergrad, or no, as in grad school, as well as some workshops for professional development as a teacher. So by no means am I a professional on implicit bias. Okay, just want to put that out there. All right, and then yeah, just want to let y'all know. And also I want to mention that, like, obviously we should all be aware that everyone has biases. Some we are aware of and some we aren't aware of. And so that's sort of the idea of this presentation. Okay, with that being said, let's do our icebreaker. So if everyone can focus your attention onto onto the tab that I had, the link that I had you open. This is sort of the icebreaker that I thought would be a good idea. I wanted you to please share your name, and I also want you to share your New Year's resolution. And for starters, whenever I ask someone to share something, as a teacher, I always like to share it first. And so I like to say, my name is Boden Zhao, and my New Year's resolution is to read more books. So if at any point you have any recommendations for books, I will gladly take them. And I'm going to be honest, I'm more of a fan of nonfiction books. So I will take any and all recommendations for nonfiction. But yeah, on your end, on your new tab, you should be able to type in your responses. I'll give you a little moment to sort of type on it. Oh, sorry. My apologies. I need to get better at this. Okay, there we go. You should be able to type now. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, at this point, you should be able to type in on your slide. There you go. Thanks for reminding me, James. So again, please type in your name and then talk about your New Year's resolution. And I'll give you a few moments. And then in a few moments, I will present. So I'll show you who's some responses from like the audience.
Do we just type it into the spot and then leave it there?
Yeah, you could just leave it there. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and if you're done typing, you could just take a look at some of your students' responses. Sorry, just to clarify, can y'all see them? Your classmates or some of the audience responses? You cannot. Okay. Give me a moment. Okay, so in order for you to see the responses, you're gonna have to look at my screen. Okay, sorry. Let's do this. There you go. So if you actually wait,
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if you look back on the Zoom screen now, on the Zoom tab, you'll be able to see who's in the audience. So Stephen has a resolution to develop more confidence professionally, right? Just take some time. I'm just going to be scrolling through them, and you could just go ahead and read through them. I'm going to be reading them as well. Hari, this is a really good goal, New Year's resolution, especially as a teacher. I can't even. I spent so many hours on the screen. Oh, cool. Hey, Wesley, what's the New Year's resolution that you have? Oh, can I also ask a question to y'all? Are you able to continue typing even though I'm showing the responses? You are. Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, got a few more. 7-track mixtape by December. Cool. Awesome. Looks like we got a lot of different interests and backgrounds here. This is awesome. Oh, I wish I knew who this was. But thank you everyone for sharing. I really wanted to use this as an opportunity to sort of get to know my audience and what they're going about. But yes, thank you all for sharing. At this point, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna not hide them anymore. And now I'm going to go back to the presentation, and we're gonna keep going. So now, like I mentioned, the second part of my activity is, or second part of my agenda is a grouping activity. So before we go into like what explicit and what implicit bias is, I sort of want to do this activity first. And we're going to be doing a grouping game, right? So just to give you an idea of what how this grouper game works is, on the next slide, there's going to be 9 cards, right? And what I want you to do is, within those 9 cards, I want you to group 3 of those cards in any way you want, any way you like. Okay, you come up with the definition of what group is and put them together. Okay, and then once you figure out what those 3 cards are, I want you to type in the Zoom chat what those 3 numbers are, but don't click enter quite yet. All right, I'm going to set a timer for about maybe like 2 minutes, and I'm going to count down from 3, and then that's when everyone presses enter at the same time, so we can all sort of see what are the different combinations, what kind of groupings that we all have. Okay, so with that being said, let's get started with the activity. So again, 9 cards on the slide. Pick 3 that you've grouped together, and then once you've gotten those 3 cards, you type in the number into the Zoom chat, and then click enter at the same time. Okay, here we go. So these are the 9 cards. You can also draw on this slide, or yeah, you can also draw on this slide if you'd like, just so it's easier for you to sort of keep track of which 3 cards. But go ahead and tell me how you grouped some of these cards. Right, and again, don't press enter quite yet in the chat. Don't press enter in the chat quite yet. Okay, take a few moments. And if you find multiple, that's fine too. You could type multiple in the chat, that's fine. Take about 30 more seconds. You probably don't even need this much time, but I'm giving it to you anyway. Okay, so when I count down from 3, can everyone's like just type in the combination that they came up with? 3, 2, 1. All right, great. Thanks, everyone. So now let's take this time now to sort of just take a look at some of the combinations that were different from yours, right? Take a look at the combinations that some of the audience had, right? So I'm just going to look down in this chat and just say the first thing that I saw 1, 3, and 7 a lot, right? 1, 3, and 7. Okay, I can sort of see where that's coming from, right? These are all the same shape, right? But different amounts, right? So you can group it that way. Awesome. Someone said 5, 6, and 8. Totally, right? 4, 5, and 9. 4, 5, and 9. Okay, nice. 1, 3, and 7. Oh yeah, someone said that already. 4, 5, 9. Someone said that. 1, 3, 8. 2, 6, 7. 2, 6, 7. Oh, okay. Yeah, totally. Y'all can make multiple groups. That's fine too. 1, 4, 7. Interesting. Interesting. Okay, so great. So I'm really actually glad that we had all these different combinations, because so let me sort of, and so I want to be honest with you, all your groupings that you made, they're all valid groupings, right? And I don't know if anyone is actually, this is actually a game. This is actually a game that it's a board game that you can actually play with. The game is called Set. And I actually like to play this game when I'm teaching geometry. But I want to sort of explain sort of why I decided to use this activity in the first place. So I decided to use this activity because this is a really easy introduction to sort of understand what are some things that we're conscious of and unconscious of, right? So like, for example, like with this activity, we can be unconsciously grouping things without knowing. Like, for example, I'm just saying this, I'm not saying this is true for everybody, but by grouping 1, 3, and 7, we already like to group things that are the same shape, right? Unconsciously, right? Just because we just tend to want to do that because they're alike, right? But some people would even notice that you could even group cards 5, 6, and 8, right? 5, 6, and 8 have nothing in common. Sorry, I shouldn't say nothing, right? But 5, 6, and 8 don't have anything in common, or like they don't have any shape in common. However, you can see that all the shapes are filled in completely, right? They're all bold, right? And they all have pairs, right? So exactly. But what I'm saying is, even with this activity, it's very obvious to see that we all like to group things differently, right? And so that's sort of the idea, sort of an introduction to sort of this idea of implicit bias. Okay. So with that being said, let's move on to the next card or next slide, which talks about. Oops. Oh, here we go. Sorry, I meant to put annotate or like animations so it shows each part at a time. But with the new app that I'm using, it doesn't allow me to do that. But that's okay. So what is implicit bias? Implicit bias is also commonly referred to as unconscious bias or unconscious stereotype, right? And the definition of implicit bias is just these stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. The way that I like to think about it is sort of like this psychology reference of the iceberg, right? This implicit bias is something that is in our unconscious that we're not aware of quite yet. And our explicit bias is something that we are aware of, that we constantly, or that we're taking action with. An example of that I want to say about explicit bias would be something along the lines of, like, if you're working in a warehouse and let's say your manager purposely gives you work that does not involve weights or something that's heavy, that is an explicit bias because that your manager realizes that or assumes that you can't lift a lot of weight because depending on what they believe in, right? So that would be an explicit bias because of their beliefs. And an example of implicit bias is something that of having like you can say that you can not associate math with any specific gender, but you could unconsciously associate math and male. That's sort of what I'm trying to, or that's the example that I mentioned in the bottom. I know it's a little bit sort of hard to grasp, but the idea is one is way more explicit because they're sort of taking action on something that they're of their own stereotype, whereas implicit bias is something that we're not exactly aware of quite yet, and it comes out in a different way. I hope that makes some sense. But again, I'm going to show you what that looks like in a classroom. Okay, and I want to sort of see where you're at, or sorry, let's sort of gauge our bias in a classroom, right? So this is a scenario that I was given in my. Oh no, can you see the scenario? Oh, you should be able to, yeah. But yeah, this is a scenario that I read in a book called "For White Folk That Want to Teach in the Hood." And this is the scenario that was given in the book, right? As a teacher of the classroom, you are writing something on the board and you are asking the class a question on the board. As you turn around, you see that there are 5 students with their hands up, eager to answer your question. Several students paying attention but don't raise their hand, and 1 student with their head down. Who are you most likely to call on to answer the question? And then how are our implicit biases showing in this scenario? So really quickly, how would you sort of address, as a teacher in the classroom, how would you sort of address this scenario, right? And again, the scenario is you just finished writing something on the board and you ask a question to the class and you turn around and you see this. Who would you most likely call on? Oh, and at this point, you can go ahead and just type in the on the slide itself, right? And I'll sort of share what we're working with, or what some responses of the audience. And then at the end, I'll explain sort of why I decided to bring the scenario up in the first place. Okay, I see a lot of people are typing. Once people are finished, some of them are finished typing, I'll show the responses to the audience. Okay, these are great conversations to have, like that are in the chat, in the Zoom chat right now. I would love if you actually put that type on the actual like app that I'm asking you to type on. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Thank you. Please type on Pear Deck, please. Okay, let's take a look at what are some of the audiences picking here. Okay. Oh, and just to clarify too, all your answers are anonymous at this point. Okay, so this is just what everyone is saying. Okay, so this person would pick the most disengaged student, but not the kid with the head down, right? I'd call on the students with their hands up first, then talk to the student with their heads down afterwards. Have everyone yell the answer at the same time to engage everyone at once, and also bring back people who dozed off lost attention. This is a really great strategy. I've actually never tried this before. I never even considered it. One of the students have their hands up, depends on mood. I'm feeling generous. One of the hands have not, then I'm grilling the one student. Call on the student head down, pick on the student to have their hands up first to see how their answers are alike. Pick the person with the hand raised, call on the student with their hands up. Paying attention, call on person with hand up. Oh, I see. Paying attention, but don't raise hand. Call on student with hand. Swift hammer of justice. Okay, interesting. Oh, I don't know why there's a link here. That's weird. Okay, so clearly a lot of people would go a lot of different routes here, right? But the reason why I wanted to bring this situation up is because in the book, it sort of flushes out sort of this idea that whatever bias that we have, we also need to consider what would happen if we did a different action that was different from what our bias was, right? So in this actual interaction, what happened was teacher chose the student that had their hand raised. However, what actually happened was, the reason why that student even had their head down to begin with was because that student had their hand raised the entire time, but took too long for the teacher to notice, so that student put their head down, right? And obviously you wouldn't have known that with this context, right? And just like as a teacher in that classroom, you wouldn't have known that with this context as well, right? So it's important for us to really consider sort of as an educator to consider what would have happened if I didn't lean towards my bias, right? But to be fair, you could have also picked a person that wasn't paying or that was paying attention, but didn't have their hand raised. And like obviously, there's going to be scenarios where if you pick certain people, they may not turn out as well, right? Because for example, let's say for example, this person that was paying attention and you picked on them and they didn't raise their hand, they didn't know the answer, and so they can feel embarrassed, right? That's clearly a possible solution, right? Or not possible solution, a possibility, right? Another possibility could also be where that student does know the answer and also builds their self-confidence because they knew the answer and were right in front of the whole classroom, right? And so as a teacher, I sort of need to balance even these small interactions, right? I need to consider like, where is a good opportunity for me to actually tap into that potential, right? Because realistically speaking, I personally think that with weighing those two options, I personally think that taking that risk of having them feel embarrassed when I know the answer versus having the potential to raise their self-esteem, I think that's worth it. Even if there is a potential for them to lose self-esteem, I think there is the possibility of gaining self-esteem is worth the risk. And so that's something that me as a teacher, I need to consider with these interactions like this. Okay. And so I wanted to give that as an example of like, what are some things as an educator that I need to deal with? And so now I want to transition to sort of what are some strategies that I do use in the classroom to sort of gauge my bias, right? And here we go, next slide. Okay, so the first thing that I do is I like to reflect on my interactions and or patterns that are showing up in my classroom. What I typically like to do is, whether it be like on my commute home or commute to school, I like to think about like, what were some interactions and or patterns that noticed me that are sort of hanging in my head, right? And then because I know that for me, like for young people, interactions have a bigger impact than they do necessarily for me, because I know that like as a young person, even the smallest things can really affect how I think, right? And after I sort of think about the interaction and reflect on those interactions and patterns, I begin to question, were those interactives like, do they have a lasting impact, whether it's positive or negative, right? And if it was positive or negative, I also want to consider like, why did the student behave that way and why did I behave that way, right? And sort of think about our actions and sort of where did they come from. And again, I like to think about whether or not it was positive or negative, because I think that digging deeper and understanding whether it was a like a constructive positive or a constructive negative interaction will go a long way to consider whether or not you want to change your practice to prevent your bias from getting in the way of their success, right? And which is my third point, right? So once I sort of come to a conclusion where I think that this interaction or pattern needs change, that's where I sort of come in, that's where I sort of begin to change my practice to prevent my bias from getting in their way. So I see that there's a hand raised. And so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and just type your question in the chat, and I'll get to it as soon as I can. Thanks. But I guess this is a good time to pause and just address your question. But I also want to emphasize that this is just the strategies that I use in my classroom. Again, by no means am I an expert. This is just what's worked for me. And this is sort of where, this is how I've sort of gone better or changed my practice for the better in the classroom. But with that being said, hard use, okay. Oh, okay, yeah. So I was going to give you some examples in this exam, in the next one, okay? So sort of like what happens in my classroom, right? So throughout my experience in the classroom, there were the ones that stood out to me that I can remember off the top of my head, or when I was making this presentation, were these four here. And I want to say the fourth one on the bottom is something that I'm currently battling with right now. I should also emphasize on the last slide too, that this process there isn't a set time to like sort of figure this, to go through the process, right? Like I would say that some biases or some of this reflection and some of this questioning took me like weeks and months to sort of like flush through. So for me, I don't have a necessary timeline for when to accomplish each thing in my sort of strategies, but I'm sort of constantly doing this as I go. And yeah, it just, for different ones, it takes a different amount of time, right? So for me as an educator, so one of the big things that I recognized as an educator was that paying attention comes in really a lot of different forms. But I understand that my bias with attention comes from them actually looking at me when I'm actually talking. So the change that I made was I have to explicitly tell them like, hey, like when I'm speaking, just so that I know that you're listening, please just look in my direction, right? Please just look in my direction so that I don't assume that you're not paying attention. So I'll just be transparent with them, right? And that's the same thing with repeating myself in the classroom. I've noticed a pattern with myself that whenever I repeat myself, I tend to repeat myself in a very aggressive tone that sounds like I'm upset or like mad. And what I just tell them instead is like I may sound upset, or like here, I'm going to repeat what I have to say and it might sound aggressive, but understand that my aggression actually stems from something that comes from my upbringing, right? And the reason why I sound so aggressive and it's so unconscious to me is because growing up, I grew up in an immigrant family where I was the youngest. And a lot of the time my parents would ask me for translations for things, right? But because I was the youngest, they wouldn't trust my translations. And so a lot of the time I would translate for them and my sister would translate for them. And even though we said the same thing, they would trust my sister more often than myself. So, and I recognize that I may sound aggressive or sound mad because early on when I was young, I felt as if I was never heard as a young child. So that's sort of where my aggression for repeating myself kind of stems from. And this is the conclusion that I came with. And so I outright tell that story to my class, right? I outright tell my story to the class and hopes that they could sort of understand where I'm coming from so that they don't get offended anyway when I sound aggressive for repeating myself. But I am conscious of that I am aggressive in repeating myself. So I also try to take some deep breaths before I actually repeat myself to remind myself that it's not that they're ignoring me in any way, or they don't have the intention of ignoring what I'm saying, right? It could be that they were distracted in some way. So I need to be conscious of that too in the classroom. The third one, math language in the classroom. So I put that on there because I recognized that in my first year of teaching that some of my Spanish speaking students were struggling in my math class. And I was trying to figure out, like, why is it that when I ask them to do some of the work, or when I ask them to show me how to do something, they're able to show me perfectly fine. But when it comes to the test, they aren't performing as well. And that's where I sort of sat down with them and talked to them and realized, like, there's a language barrier. Math itself has a lot of vocabulary and terminology that is very unique to math only, which they're not used to seeing, right? And realizing that, I've begun to sort of take math language have put more importance on math language. So instead of just assuming that all my students understand terminology and words from the previous math classes, I sort of front load that by going over what these specific terms are referring to, what they mean, and sort of show examples of what I'm asking of, so that when it comes to test day, they sort of understand where we're coming from. And it's also led to me sort of rephrasing a lot of tests as well, so that, again, language doesn't get in the way of their success. And then the last one that I put in the slide here is, I also noticed within my experience with teaching that there's a really strong correlation with rapport with me and the student, and also their grade, right? And I'm beginning to think about, like, is it because I'm being biased with my grading, or is it that the student is consciously engaging more because I built a rapport with them? That's something that I'm still constantly trying to figure out right now. And I'm still working on whether or not that's a bias towards me and that I need to improve on, or whether it's just the students actually like engaging more, right? And then on the quote that you see on the right side, it says, once educators recognize that they are biased against form of brilliance other than their own, they can finally begin to truly teach. And the reason why I highlighted this quote, and Christopher Emden is also the author of the book that I mentioned before of For White Folk Who Teach in the Hood. But the reason why I highlighted this quote is because I think that as an educator, we can really hold a lot of young people back if with our own biases. And the more conscious that we are of our own biases, we can potentially tap into their potential. So the more aware we are of our own biases, we can actually let them sort of be who they are, right? And so that's sort of why I put that quote there. Okay. So with that being said, I want to now show a video on this video is called Implicit Bias. And I want to sort of put a disclaimer after I show the video. Okay. But again, it's about implicit bias in the education system. And I'm actually going to ask us to now actually transition to sort of the Zoom screen, because the next slide is actually a slide with a video on it, but I don't actually think that you can play the video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen on Zoom and play the video through Zoom. So give me one moment. And I want to make sure I share audio too. Okay, great. So let me play this video. Okay, sorry, some technical difficulties. I'm not sure why this video is not playing. Give me a second. Sorry, I have to look up the video on YouTube to find the video. Sorry, give me one moment.
Meet Joe and Gabby. Both grew up in low-income communities, attended the same low-performing high school, graduated with a 3.5 GPA, and are starting their higher education journeys at their local community college.
Okay, so one thing I want to highlight, which is the disclaimer that I mentioned earlier, is that this video highlights a lot of like systemic racism, and I want to highlight. Oops, sorry, there wasn't a video. Okay, but I want to highlight that this video was aimed to sort of highlight that implicit bias plays a role in this systemic racism, right? And so it's important for me as an educator to be aware of my implicit biases when in the classroom. That's sort of what I wanted to get at when showing that video. Okay. So at this point, the question now goes into sort of transitions now to like sort of how do we be aware of our biases, right? And so what I want to highlight now is if you can go back to your pair deck slides. On the next slide, we're going to go into sort of a resource that you could use to sort of you could use to check your biases, right? And this resource is called Project Implicit. And I can send out this link in the chat. Just give me a moment. And I'm also going to show you what like it looks like to even take this associative test, right? And so just to give an idea of what Project Implicit is, it's a nonprofit organization that is aimed to make people more aware, or not make people, but like who are interested in implicit social cognition and their thoughts and feelings outside of conscious awareness and control. And they have a range of implicit association tests, which I want to show y'all. So if y'all can sort of, I'm going to share my screen again. And if y'all could just take a look. So when you open up the website, it's going to look like this, right? And I know it's a little hard to like read, to navigate because there's not a lot of buttons, but you want to go on the bottom, click take a test. And then from there, it just wants to give you a disclaimer on anything that, because they are going to use the data that you provide them to sort of as sort of like further testing or like further research. And then you just click I wish to proceed. And there's like a bunch of different types of implicit association tests. And the idea is within all these tests, it's the same idea. So, but I'm going to show you an example of what the race one looks like. So the race one up here looks like, and this is one I've actually taken before as a grad student as well as a teacher again, just to sort of where I'm coming from, or like just to sort of understand what the test is like. And then so after you sort of answer some questions on some of your background and your preferences, they're going to sort of give you this test. And so they sort of define what good words are, what bad words are, pictures of African Americans, and then pictures of European Americans. And then what they do is they basically just sort of associate, and they ask you to use your keyboard, but they want to associate good words with a certain race, and then bad words with a certain race based on the pictures. And then they're also going to give you another part of the test where where they try to see if you can disassociate those words from your initial association. So initially, they're going to ask you to, like, again, associate good with African American, and then, good with European American and bad with African American, and then see how well you can sort of disassociate those two. So I'm just going to really quickly go over an example. So this is European American, so this would be I, right? I'm going through this relatively quickly because I'm just showing you as an example of what's going on here, right? Just making sure that you could recognize European American and African American based on the pictures that they can show you, right? And then here's where they sort of, and again, this is again part 2 of it, where they again associate those keys on your keyboard that you associated with African American and European American to also the words good and bad. And then later parts in this association test, they're going to ask you to sort of see if you can disassociate from that, like sort of break that association. Okay. But with that being said, I want to sort of give a disclaimer because with these association tests have a really big asterisk on them, because these tests cannot be considered incredibly reliable or incredibly valid because of sort of how tests work, right? Because like the way that, like for example, using the SAT, if you were to take the SAT several times, you'd give a relatively close score to your other scores. However, with these association tests, you can take them multiple times and get very different outcomes. So it isn't the best use for like what I'm trying to say is you shouldn't use this test to just as a way to just tell your bias. You can use it as a baseline of your understanding of yourself. I just want to make sure I clarify that, because I don't want anyone taking these association tests and thinking one way about themselves. Again, I think it's a really good way to look at your use as a baseline. Again, after you've gotten that resource, I know that, and yeah, so I want to sort of move on from here because you can, obviously I would love for all of you to take it on your own time and to sort of use this as an opportunity to sort of reflect on yourself and grow in that way. But now I want to go into sort of like, because I know we come from different backgrounds, like why is being aware of implicit biases important for someone that's not a teacher, for example? And these are sort of things I was able to come up with. And the first thing that I think that about why we should be aware of implicit biases is because I think it makes us a well-rounded person, right? By questioning our beliefs and reflecting on them, I think it makes us really sort of understand where we're coming from and get a better understanding of ourselves. And that's sort of why I put that there. And then the second one is I think it's important for us to be aware of our biases so that we could sort of tap into the possibilities that we may not be aware of, right? Within the past couple of years, big companies like Facebook and Google, they've actually done a lot of implicit biases workshops because they recognize that by being aware of their biases, they could sort of create a better product that isn't focused on a certain population, right? Some of us like they were mentioning how by building the product they have with the people that they have, they are only building their product to fit a certain population. However, if they consider the things that are, they consider their own biases, they could expand that product to fit more populations and create a bigger product. And that's sort of where I'm coming from when I say why we should be aware of our implicit biases. Okay. But with that being said, I believe that this is sort of like the end of my presentation. But I want to make sure we sort of get an opportunity to sort of talk to each other about implicit bias and also have a conversation and also ask any questions that we may have about implicit biases. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to split us up into breakout rooms, and I would like for us to just have a discussion. You don't have to answer these questions at all. These are just questions to just spark a conversation. And also you can type on this slide on your Pear Deck slide in the case that you would like to type on there to take notes. But I would love for us to have a conversation within these breakout rooms about implicit bias.
Hello.
Hello.
We have both the Lux in here. There's too many Lux.
Yeah. Well, now there's too many. It says, okay, how has your upbringing shaped your biases, interactions with people at work, school, family, with strangers? What are some advantages and disadvantages of knowing your biases? How do you unlearn your bias? What is your experience with implicit bias? I think a good example that he brought up is like eye contact. Actually, like, I don't know if it was a group project for school, but I was assigned to a group project. And then one of my group mates like never looked at the camera when we were talking. So I thought she just was not paying attention. But like later on, she told me like she's Indian and she was like in her culture, like I guess when growing up, like she just it was never a thing to look at people because that's actually disrespectful. And I was like, oh. So
wait, so you called her out on it?
No, I didn't call her out.
Bitch, why aren't you looking at me?
I didn't call her out.
I think everyone's back now. But at this point, I wanted to sort of open this up as a discussion and/or question session on just what you talked about in your group. So would anyone like to get us started? I see Amy has her hand raised. Go ahead, Amy.
It's not necessarily sharing, but our group was trying to like better understand the difference between explicit and implicit bias. And so could you kind of go over that again, please?
Honestly speaking, I myself have issues sort of differentiating the two as well. But the one, I don't know how else to sort of.
Maybe just by examples?
Yeah,
just
so
throw out a bunch of examples.
Sure. How do I guess I'm going to use Anna's example that she mentioned earlier because she mentioned it in our group earlier because she was mentioning how when she's actually Anna, do you want to say it yourself?
Sure. Ooh, am I muted?
No, you're good.
No.
We hear you.
Okay. Okay. So we were talking about how as a leader and a worker, okay, let's start. When I'm a leader, I tend to give work to people who are more competent. And I find that the same thing happens to me when I'm the worker. Leaders tend to give me work because I'm more competent instead of giving the work to everyone else to be fair. And Andy and Gordon kind of pointed out that, well, that sounds more like explicit bias, right? Explicit bias because it's not subconscious, right? You're consciously doing that because X person is more competent. Instead of basing it on something like, oh, because they're Asian, I'm gonna give it to them, or they're female, so I'm gonna give it more to them.
And then an example of implicit bias was something that Jenny mentioned earlier. Jenny, do you want to sort of give your example?
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so my example was at work, like every month or so, there would be these teenagers who come in and like fill their cart up, like the whole cart up with our candy, and they would just run out. And they were Black. And what I was struggling with for a little while is like whenever I rang up a customer who happened to be, like a young Black teenager, I would find myself kind of I could feel the judging creeping in. And I mean, I know it's wrong. Like, I definitely know it's wrong, but it's something that I was struggling with for a while because it just made me so angry, Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. So yeah, like something that I try to think about too is sort of like, what are some habits, or actually, I don't know if habit's the right word, but what are some thinking habits that I have? Although it may be really hard to recognize what those thinking habits are, because sometimes our implicit biases sort of show in circumstances that we don't expect them to show up in, right? Sort of like in Jenny's situation, right? So I don't know how else to better explain it other than using the examples. But yeah, I struggle with trying to identify as well.
I just have a quick follow-up. So our group is talking about how like when we see an African American person, like we subconsciously kind of like guard things closer. Would that be an explicit or implicit? Because I was mentioning that because you're consciously doing it, wouldn't that be explicit?
If you're acting in that way in the moment, then it's definitely implicit, right? Because it's not like you can see them coming. It's like, for example, if a Black person was walking down the block, then you see them coming, you wouldn't like do that in their face, right? It's like they just came around the corner and you were just shocked and you just reacted in that way. So if it's like sort of a reaction, a quick reaction, I would think that it's more of an implicit bias. Yeah. And I see Hari, and hopefully that helps. But again, I am no expert. I just want to explain that one more time. Hari, go ahead.
Could we also suggest that maybe, I mean, you said in the definition earlier, you mentioned that implicit bias is when it's an unconscious reaction, and an explicit bias is when it's a conscious reaction. So I would argue that in Amy's example, that would be an implicit bias that then turned into an explicit bias. She implicitly said or thought, reacted, I got to clutch my purse closer or whatever. But then the explicit bias was, no, that's not necessarily a scenario. So she was like, maybe I should behave this way. And so going off of that, and then maybe we could say that we should make an effort to make implicit bias into an explicit bias. And that primes us to be aware of our effect primes us to be aware of our effect on our environment and the people around us. So that way we're able to better ourselves.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you.
You did.
I have one. So Wesley, Yowie, Henry, and I were in a group, and we were talking about like in the workplace what biases we have. One situation was like my company is a lot of Belgium people because the company's based in Belgium, and also Spanish speaking, and then 1% Asian. So not too many like, well, not too many like Chinese people or like Indian people. So then I like noticed like 3 weeks in, I was like, oh, I got put in a group with all the other Asian people. And at first I was like, well, I was like, how do I feel about that? Because I feel like they did it intentionally. And there's like good to it because I immediately felt more comfortable in that group, I guess. But at the same time, I'm like, oh, like I kind of want to mix with all the other people that are in the company. But I feel like the company didn't have any ill intentions. They just wanted to maybe make me feel comfortable or make me feel like belonging or something. But that's like something I noticed.
So, I mean, the question in this context is, do you think your company did that explicitly or implicitly, whoever was making that decision?
Definitely explicitly because they consciously put me into a group.
Yeah.
And they probably thought about like possible combinations and whatnot. So
Yeah, my point of view on that, like as a policy perspective, I think all your whenever you're making policy, all of your reasoning behind the policies should be explicitly stated and clear for everyone to think over, because I think on both sides of that, like, should we, for lack of a better word, segregate groups versus meaning having one group of all the Asians in one group versus spreading them out everywhere. That same conversation is going on in our society, right? For example, like for example, in the news, it was like Harvard, all of the clubs in colleges around the nation, they have like ethnicity-based groups, and they host their own graduation ceremonies, for example, right? And the question is it better or worse to have everyone grouped together or spread them out? But there's reasons for both of that, right? Because again, Carmen did say she's more comfortable among the other Asians versus the benefits of being spread out. So seeing as there's benefits to both paths, I think it's best to have the reasonings made clear to everybody, and maybe say, oh, next year, why don't we do something different next year? Something like that. Those are my thoughts.
In Carmen's scenario, that's kind of, I feel like that's of two minds. What you can say that they had negative, I mean, maybe not even negative intentions, but they just wanted her to be able to connect better with people who are like her, so they did that on purpose. If that may be a scenario, but is that a good enough reason for them to have done something like that? Is that sort of bias acceptable almost?
Yeah, I was thinking the same lines as you, Hari. I was like thinking maybe they did that for you out of comfort, maybe, I don't know. But at the same time, does that justify them grouping you, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the definitely is better to always have transparency in that decision making, and have a path for changing the policy if people want to have open a path for the employees to speak to the director or HR to address it, and don't keep it hidden, or don't keep the reasonings mysterious, and now we're second guessing, like, are they being racist or not, right? That's not a healthy thing for your employees to be in the back of their head when they go to work every day. Right.
So then they should have been smart enough to realize that the consequences of their actions are going to cause these kinds of thoughts. So maybe don't even engage in that. Just randomly group people together, right? To avoid that sort of questioning from their employees.
To be fair, that was what happened like a year ago, but now like the grouping has changed and it's not all Asian people anymore. So I feel like I don't know. Yeah, I feel like they're like pretty fair about it.
Maybe someone threatened a lawsuit in the back.
I just don't know why at that point in time. Maybe it was just chance. I don't know.
I had a general question for Boden. Since this bias thing is it's an ongoing and potentially like a lifelong process, right? Constant reflection. Because of course we're talking about implicit, which is like you're not thinking about it every day. How often do teachers do these workshops and stuff like that? Like officially, that you set up a day for or something? Is it once a year or something, and is it enough in your opinion, or should you be doing more?
That's a good question. I would so what the district does is they have like a whole bunch of like professional development sessions, and sort of like teachers get to choose what they want to be a part of. It's like a professional development workshop type of deal, and I think in every session there's always an implicit bias workshop, but I don't know how many people actually like go in there, and I don't know how different it is, because I think right, because if it's the same type of workshop, once you go the first time, you don't need to go. People will assume you don't need to go again and sort of consider how it's expanded. But I personally don't think it's enough, mainly because I think that, well, we also need to understand a lot of the teachers, like in general, are much older. Like this idea and concept of implicit bias is a relatively new terminology that a lot of, I would say, the older teachers are not very aware of, and they have to like consciously go out and like hunt for this information to even be exposed to it. So I personally don't think it's enough, but again, there are opportunities for teachers to actually look into what implicit bias is and whatnot.
I think earlier during the presentation, so we couldn't really discuss it, was like there were questions about like, oh, how do you deal with bias in your grading? I think Andy was curious, I think on a good faith basis, about like, how does bias leak into sort of grading mathematics?
Yeah. So let me, So I mentioned this because I was in Andy's room, so I was able to talk to him about this. But to address bias with math, so let me clarify also that grading in general is just subjective as a whole, right? Like choosing a problem to be worth X amount of points in itself is subjective. And then also, like, because the district is moving moving away from like just getting the right answer and more on the process and understanding of math, it's become even more subjective in that way, because for the most part, when I'm grading a paper, if I get two different answers, or if I get two different answers to a solution or to a problem, where one answer is where they show the process and they get the wrong answer, versus an answer where it's the correct answer but no work is shown for the process and understanding, I would lean more towards giving the person that has that has shown the process more points, because that's sort of what the district is pushing for. And also another way that the district is sort of battling that too is they're also coming up with district tests, where these district tests have like district rubrics, and these rubrics are very like down to the detail of like, oh, if this person like got the negative sign wrong, this is the score that they would get, type of deal. And so that's sort of how the district and how sort of math has changed throughout the years. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Do you think like the English teachers or whatnot like have to deal with this a little more, or do they have just as stringent standards regarding like this means that?
Yeah, I can't speak and I can't speak anything on English because I have no clue what they look for in their district tests.
Hey, when you mentioned, I didn't catch it. When you mentioned the specific criteria in the math grading, is that you're saying you use that right now?
I use it for district milestones. So like if there's a test that the school district wants me to give, then I use that rubric that the district provides to me. However, when I'm grading my own students, I come up with a rubric with everyone else that's teaching the same subject, and we grade based on that rubric.
How, when you say everyone that teaches the same subject in the school, in the district?
In the school. So like I would be like, if I'm grading my algebra papers, I meet with my algebra teachers and think about what are the things we're looking for in this test. This is the rubric that we come up with for the grade that we give for this test, and then we go from there.
Yeah, it's kind of off topic. So when the district wants you to administer a certain test, those are regular, right? Or I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah, so we give about 2 a school year, so there's like once per semester.
Okay. Cool. And I mean, is that your students' performances on those tests? Does that, how does that affect, anything in your day-to-day at WASH, for example, or is it just for data for the district?
It has some weight to their grade in the classroom.
Okay.
But yeah, but in terms of for the district though, it does not do anything for the district. Sorry, it's just data for them to use.
Okay, so you're not concerned that the district is tracking your performance, for example?
I'm not concerned about that.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I thought those questions were directed towards me in the chat. But I also want us to be conscious of time too. I want to respect everyone else's time. We said that we were going to meet from 2 to 3:30. It's currently 3:33. Does anyone have any like last remarks before we like close this out?
I would just mention that everyone should expect an email after the event. It'll link to a web page that will have resources like the link to that test. And yeah, that's it for me. Keep an eye out for our next event, which is sometime next month. That's all from me.
Boden, can you put the survey link in the chat?
Oh yeah, give me a sec.
My computer died.
So we have a survey to give some feedback. Let me link that survey in the chat right now. And if you could help fill it out, that'd be great. So get some feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll also link that in the email in case people don't want to do it right now, right at this moment.
Oh, did you tell them about the next part?
Not yet. Alrighty, if no one else has anything else, call it a day.
All right.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Boden.
you,
That was great.
Boden.
Yeah, no sweat.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Keep an eye out for the next one. Thanks.
That was a good presentation.
Will, check your